Oh, guys.
later. Do you have to go, Sam? If you have to go, you
I'll
have
get.
to go.
I'll give you a couple more minutes.
So MMT, the it stands for Mikitzat Maaseh HaTorah. Yeah, it's in Hebrew. I'm sorry, that's why everybody is referring to it as MMT. Have I told you about Strugnell before? He was the guy who was in charge of the Dead Sea Scrolls for many years. And what happened was he was having an interview with Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper, and he went on an anti-Semitic tirade, which made everybody, blow up at him, and he ended up quitting his job and checking into rehab, and he basically lost his mind. And when I read MMT on Sunday, it was like, okay, I can see why a Christian would completely lose his mind and turn to drink.
Okay. What's your punchline? I'm trying to Google this thing. It's a letter sent from the leaders of Qumran to the priestly establishment in Jerusalem, presumably the Sadducees or something. And that's about as far as I've gotten.
So the punchline is that the environment the environment in which Second Temple Judaism existed is very, very different from anything we thought. The Sadducees and the Essenes and everybody seems to have been far more in line with Pharisaic Judaism than anybody ever thought. And it's I think James Tabor, basically his takeaway has been that the book of Acts is just obviously bad, and a lot of people are throwing the Gospel of Luke into that as well. And
that is not a new critique, but like so I like, first off, I will say that I think that Christian scholarship has improved leaps and bounds over the 20th century. Part of that is better methods, but part of that is gaining access to a whole bunch of different stuff, whether it is translations of church fathers to the Dead Sea Scrolls to like the I don't know, the Ugaritic stuff in northern Syria that was from like a Baal temple, and like etc. Nakamadi.
Yeah.
Right.
No, the archaeology, Christianity has not caught up with the archaeology.
And that's what people like Michael Heiser get their mileage from, right? Is that gap between popular Christianity and the state of current scholarship.
The gap is so much more than anything I knew.
Okay, if you're telling me that most Christians are wrong about the stuff they think is most important, I will say that's what I grew up being taught.
No, yes, I realize that, Sam. We're talking seriously throwing the Book of Acts out, and the Book of Acts is very foundational to Christianity.
So, what exactly is so bad about the Book of Acts? Because, like, what document is more historically well attested than the Book of Acts, right? Like, what exactly has trustworthy leverage over the Book of Acts? And for what reason would it have trustworthy leverage over the Book of Acts?
The Dead Sea Scrolls.
Why would the Dead Sea Scrolls have any more authority on history than the Book of Acts does?
Because they're 200 years, they're dated to 200 years before Acts.
No, they're not. They start from 200 years before and go to a little bit after when Acts was written, if I understand correctly.
Look, the closer you get to Acts, what the Dead Sea Scrolls are describing is so far away from what Acts is talking about that the best thing you can say, well, it's not the best thing, but what Robert Eisenman does say, and honestly, his book, it's 1,000 pages, and I've been like reading it like, oh my God. I've been reading it I've been reading it before bed, and I've been staying up late. Okay. And I take sleep medication.
PVK said Jacob should read commentaries on the Book of Acts if he thinks people don't debate its relationship with contemporary history. Right? Like Jacob,
It's
like
so much
Protestants
worse
have
than
been
you
trying
think.
to destroy our own canon for hundreds of years. We're better at it
It's
than anyone.
so much worse than you're thinking.
But
I
like
my
Jacob, like
jaw,
what book was
jaw
written
dropped
by
open.
so
Sam,
Jacob,
when I
okay,
read MMT, my jaw dropped open.
people have taken DMT and said the same thing. But like, so what book is more authoritative than the Book of Acts, which was written by someone who had some amount of historical training in the mid 60s, say, and had all sorts of eyewitness, connections, and was an eyewitness to much of the events in his own
Okay,
book himself.
you either have to believe that MMT is some sort of somebody. You have to believe that
So what
somebody
is the
was
content of
deliberately.
MMT that is in so direct contradiction to the Book of
So,
Acts?
okay, it's a letter from, as best we can tell, either Yosef is the only other person who's actually read MMT here. Um, you could jump on thing. Um, it is slow. It's a few. Well, there is the thing as well. There's the 5 second lag that it has to catch up, Paul.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but the I- it's either a letter from the Essenes or breakaway Sadducees to the priesthood in the temple, and it reads like a modern rabbinic responsum. Okay,
Okay, sorry, one
meaning
second. I am sending a text, but I'm listening.
meaning that meaning that at the very least the Sadducees were much closer to the Pharisees than we ever assumed.
I mean, I assume, like, so, okay, great. They were still recognizable groups that had similarities and differences. If we
No, no,
need
no,
to
no, no.
dial the similarities up higher and tone down the differences, I
The,
don't
the
see.
similarity, they're so close. They're so close,
Well, I
Sam.
mean,
It's
oftentimes the groups that
surprising
have
to
the
me.
biggest fights with each other are groups that are the most similar to each other, but
Yes,
disagree on, what is
yes,
the
but
narcissism of small differences, which
yes,
seems
but
to be
this
the what you get from the Book of
circumscribes,
Acts.
but it circumscribes what was going on during the time of Jesus in ways that excludes much of what Acts says.
But again, why should some fragment from the desert be more authoritative than the Book of Acts? Just because some
Because
Jews
some
wrote it doesn't
fragments
mean
from
it's
the
more
desert.
authoritative than what a
Are
Christian
you
writes.
seriously asking that?
Yes.
Because it's some ancient fragment from the desert that has that what, unless you're going to believe somebody actually created it in order to make Acts look bad.
Well, it could have been created for all sorts of purposes, and it could have all sorts of its own inaccuracies. It's not like only Christian books can be inaccurate and pagan and Jewish sources are always 100% correct. Which is sometimes an assumption of literal criticism, which is an ironic stance that
And
it takes.
assumption of literal criticism is that people who are not involved in
Literary
issue, literary criticism, is that people who are not involved in an issue it are are more likely, when you get information from an objective source, which if
What's
MMT,
objective about MMT that isn't objective about Acts? Why doesn't Acts get to count as objective?
because MMT is just a communication between two people.
Luke of Acts was written by, the guy named Luke to someone named Theophilus who requested it of him.
Eh,
and probably funded it.
MMT is a letter from the leader of the Qumran community
Acts is a
to
letter from
the
Luke to
high priest.
Theophilus. So, like, do
You're,
the
you're,
people who
okay,
wrote
you're
MMT
going
not
into
have
apologetic
perspectives and
mode.
motivations and
Sam,
biases
you're
and
going
faults?
into apologetic mode.
I'm
You're,
not
you're,
going
not,
into
you're not
apologetic mode. I'm
actually,
undermining you.
you, you can undermine all you want.
So what exactly
The
is it
point is,
about? What exactly is it about MMT that's in such contradiction to Acts? Pharisees and Sadducees being similar but different is not in contradiction to Acts.
the similarities are,
So
well,
which similarities did Acts get wrong that were actually there that Acts said weren't? Like, as far
okay,
as I remember, the only difference that the book of Acts says between them is that they disagreed about the resurrection and that Paul used that to his advantage when he was in a courtroom once.
no, so yeah, no, it's more about um the Jews in at the time of Jesus and what was going on at the time of John and what
John the Baptist.
yeah, John the Baptist, yeah. And what the milieu was around James, the brother of John. Honestly, there's a reason
But
why
Acts is from that
Eisenman's
same
book is
milieu. Acts
2,000
was written in that
pages
same milieu. So why is that, like, why does
long.
Qumran get to count as that milieu, but Acts doesn't get
Hold
to
on.
count as that milieu?
When do you think Acts was written? Before
Well,
or after the
after
destruction?
Paul arrived in Rome, but before he was killed, which would put it in like
It's
64 or something like that, mid early
okay.
60s.
A lot of people are. I mean, at least the academics place Acts closer to 100.
Like it depends what you mean also by written, like when is the first time we can find like transmissions of it
Right.
being copied. But if you ask when it's written, it's pretty obvious when it's written.
I'm.
It ends
I'm
right
not
when Paul
trying to.
gets to Rome, but it stops before he was killed
I'm
and
not
before the
trying
temple
to
was
argue
destroyed.
the point with you, Sam.
Okay. So Acts
I
was written in the mid 60s. You asked when I thought and why I thought it, and I
right.
gave you
And
reasons.
okay, and I am trying to explain to you why this is so explosive, and you're giving me arguments against it as opposed to hearing
Okay.
why it's explosive. It's
All right.
explosive because when you look from a secular standpoint, if you believe that MMT is representing, so we know the Pharisees from the rabbinic tradition, and now we have a letter from uh, what Eisenman's maximalist position is. He actually believes MMT was either written by James, Jesus, or John.
The Baptist or the
Yes,
author
the
of the
Baptist.
gospel? The Baptist. Okay.
He believes MMT was written by one
By
of those.
possibly Jesus. Okay.
Yes,
All right.
yes, yeah. And if it's true, and frankly, now that I, I mean, I could I could understand it. Look,
What does
the
MMT say? I'm still unclear to me. It seems like it's
it's just
mostly
a rabbinic
complaining.
response. It's
It
just
seems like it's
typical.
mostly complaining that the temple
Yeah,
wasn't taking purity
yeah.
laws strictly enough.
It's just a normal. When they first found it, one of the reasons it's called MMT is when they first found it, they thought it was a Mishnaic text. When it was first found, they thought it
Is
was
it
a
from
rabbinic text.
Qumran? Did they find it in the
It's
caves in
from
Qumran? Oh,
Qumran.
okay.
Yes, they found 5 copies or 3 copies in Qumran and reconstructed it.
Okay. I have no reason to doubt that. But like, what's it saying that's so explosive? It seems like I'm reading the summaries of it.
It's
Seems like
no,
they're complaining about the temple not following purity laws
well,
strictly enough.
okay. I mean, Eisenman has a lot of theories, and look, Eisenman is very controversial, but you don't have to take Eisenman's position to start drinking if you're Strugnell. And frankly, I think that's why Strugnell started drinking.
Okay, so but like what's so explosive? It's still entirely unclear to me
What's
what's
explosive is how closely it mirrors rabbinic Judaism. That's what's explosive.
okay. So I've never not thought that rabbinic
Oh, no, no,
Judaism
no.
was an outgrowth of
The
post.
Sadducees I mean, we basically no, we thought the Sadducees were very, very different. Like the dating of the Mishnah at around 200 and the Talmud at 500, like this looks like something that's written by somebody who studies Talmud.
Okay. So it is pushing that form of stuff earlier.
Yeah, by 500 years.
Okay, so like
By the Jewish accounting, not even by the Christian
okay,
accounting.
but like what does that do? So Judaism was Jewish, all right. Congrats.
Christianity was Jewish.
I think one difference is Acts clearly has polemic and MMT doesn't to it. It appears to be a private letter. But still, so okay, so Judaism was Jewish and Christianity was Jewish. If you want to tell me that you think that Christianity was more Jewish in its origins than it was later understood to be by itself, that's a point that I always make.
It's far, far more Jewish than even I ever thought. On Sunday, when I read MMT, my jaw dropped.
Okay, why? What sentences or what
Because
content was it?
because I could see that being published by a rabbi written today.
Okay, great.
It's
So like
it's like,
what's your
and
angle?
that's what I said to Yosef. I'm like, this could have been published today. MMT is a reconstructed text from fragments found in Qumran.
So what you're saying is that some of the traditions and habits and style and form of writing and form of argumentation that were previously attributed to the rise of
And
rabbinic
things that
Judaism a
were
couple hundred years after the destruction of the temple might predate the destruction of the temple.
um the so when they're having their argument, they're having it with assumptions that, like, so he's writing a letter telling the high priest what he doesn't like about what's going on in the temple, right?
And mainly in the form of ritual purity practices.
Mostly, yeah. And the assumptions he makes, as far as, like, so the Jewish position is that what is in the Mishnah is historically accurate, but the Mishnah after um, was written after the destruction of the temple. And honestly, even Yosef and I
So
have,
Yosef is saying that because it reads like it was written by a rabbinic Jew, it means that rabbinic Jewish intellectual culture was not limited to Pharisees, but was cross-sectarian.
yes.
Okay, I mean, I've also read a lot of recent Christian scholarship that, I mean, you won't like this part, but like that ties a lot of early Christian exegesis of the Old Testament to various, kind of rabbinic style forms of interpretation, but that Christianity modified it in a Christocentric way.
Um, Look, I am not opposed to people trying to re-understand Christianity from from a stance of studying these things. I would love to see Christianity move towards things that Father Stephen and what you call it? What's the bishop?
Damic. Oh, Baron?
No,
No,
N.T. Wright.
N.T. Wright.
Right. So um, I better understand now why N.T. Wright and Father Stephen are making the arguments that they are. Christianity, the story Christianity has been telling, I don't think you have to stop saying the story that Father Stephen is telling himself. Like, Father Stephen seems to, and I definitely want to read his book, Faith of the Apostles, because he seems to be like,
His main point
understanding.
is that various practices of Orthodox Christianity are much more Jewish than they appear, basically. Right. And therefore are more apostolic than people like me might try and argue that they are.
And he's re-understanding Paul and what Paul says, and
Christians are always re-understanding Paul. I'm
well,
having a
thank God,
conversation
because
with a Danish
the
scholar
closer you
tomorrow
get to
morning.
the truth, the further the further you move away from Paul, the better. But it's I did not realize on how much um
But I don't think that Christianity, or at least my form or whatever, is dependent on rabbinic Judaism being a, a late classical development. And maybe some forms or some arguments are here, are there, but like I don't see what the bombshell is. It's not
oh,
like
by the way, Eisenman and so this is something that we still hear people talking about the Zohar being written in like the 1200s. What was the name? Moses de Leon writing the Zohar. Like that's completely out the window. Um, there is the sectarian
so.
text.
At best, it seems like you're telling me that some counter-Jewish forms of Christian apologetics are undermined by this, but not that
A
like
lot of
I
a
still
lot
don't
of
understand how the Book of Acts is in any way undermined.
because how it portrays, for example, the Jerusalem Council, I think is well. Look, when it comes
We
down to
only
it,
know about the Jerusalem Council because of the Book of Acts.
I understand that, but
And kind of from Galatians, but mostly even you could read Galatians and still not really understand what happened. It's
right,
from the Book
but
of Acts that we even know
well,
there was such a thing.
right, but um, basically, basically, the best you can do is take a new perspectives um, thing of Paul. You basically like the old.
Okay, so the Lutherans are wrong. Okay, that like but I'm just kidding, kind of. But like, at best it seems to me like, Christianity doesn't have anything to fear undermining it. Like, so at best things like MMT can help illuminate stuff that we misunderstood, but then the end result of that is that Christianity understands itself better, which
Oh,
has been the result of Dead Sea Scrolls and Nag Hammadi and translations from church fathers that had been in
I
Armenian for the last 2000 years, etc.
you're preaching to the choir. I want Christianity to understand itself much better. I am very and Yosef agrees with you. He thinks it's not as explosive as I do. Um, I think Christian. I see why Christianity has been changing so rapidly a lot better now, having seen the text and reading James, the brother of Jesus. It's 1,000 pages long, and honestly, I don't. He rambles, and I don't think
If you
it's.
write a 100-page summary for me, Jacob, I'll read it, but I'm probably not going to read that book. But like also,
Yeah,
like I'm the sort of Christian that thinks like we need to constantly be learning more about early Christianity to be a better restorationist, where the best way to have Christianity
and
now
this is why
is
I
to
wanted
be
to
as
talk to
in
you about
okay.
it.
Well, great, but I still don't understand what I'm supposed to have learned from MMT other than that some of the forms of rabbinic commentary are more common among the Sadducees and the Essenes than we previously thought. And like at best, I can be like, okay, well, that strengthens kind of what I suspect that a lot of the forms of Old Testament exegesis that you see in the New Testament are more Jewish than we realize. Like when Paul's doing
Oh,
allegorical interpretation of the Old Testament to understand Christian truth, that has its roots in some rabbinic stuff.
I think if you're seeing Paul in a way that makes Acts actually um, accord with the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you're seeing Paul in a way that through Acts that accords with the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're going to at the very least end up with Paul in Judaism. Paul,
So by
with
Paul in Judaism, you mean that so there's some sort of and like for the record, there are some biblical Unitarians that I argue with from time to time that are very into Paul in Judaism, and I push back on them some amount because I think that they get some important things wrong. But for the people listening, Paul in Judaism is basically like early Christian communities were much more Judeo-centric, with Jews being something like what you would call Noahides on the fringes, and like it was much more in parallel to the way that God-fearers had participated in Hellenistic Jewish synagogues than is currently understood, unless, um, there is no Jew nor Greek anymore, sort of thing, that is somewhat
Well,
understood.
that is a part of it, but also that Paul's meaning when he was talking about the law, either either you're going to take my view of it, or you're going to take
What's
an
your view
empty
of
white.
it?
My view is that Paul was a horrible person who was lying through his teeth
What was
to.
he? What exactly was he lying about? Well, so like interestingly, so next
Okay,
weekend,
Acts 21. We how many times have I sent you to Acts 21?
a fair amount. So
Yeah,
so next weekend, I'm going to the main Unitarian annual conference, and
and you didn't invite me. Thanks a
I didn't
lot.
invite. Well, you can still register. I think you might be past registration. Sorry. It's in Ohio. I'm going to this main thing, and I got my paper accepted to present. And so I'm talking a lot about how the Eucharist is basically the Christianized form of temple worship, in a certain sense, in a weird kind of way, and therefore Jesus is not the recipient of early Christian worship. He is the leader and the offering in early Christian worship, right? That's my main point, which is, you've probably seen on the internet, lots of Christians recently are trying to make early Christians thought Jesus is God because they worshiped him arguments in various levels of detail, right? And so
I
my what
I did not know this.
Okay, so this is a new common form of Trinitarian apologetics. Early Christians worshiped Jesus, therefore they thought he was divine in some sense. Therefore, the Trinity is much older than, people like me like to make it out to be. And so my counterpoint is like, actually, no, early Christian worship was the Eucharist, and Jesus is the high priest in heaven presenting himself as the offering to God in the heavenly temple. And that Christians participate in this in a spiritual sense through the bread and the wine, right? And that it was in the same way that Jews sacrificed animals and then participated in eating the animals in the temple, right? That's the same thing that's going on, just in this sort of spiritualized sense with bread and wine and Jesus in the heavenly temple, etc. Right? What?
Okay, I mean it's not. I don't agree with you, but
All right.
yeah.
So part of this is like really digging into the nitty gritty of First Corinthians, right? Because First Corinthians is the epistle that talks about this in the most detail, right? Where Paul explicitly parallels Old Testament altar worship with Lord's Supper worship, right? And
my
also what?
my favorite book, First Corinthians. If
But
I were
part of the
going to like,
problem, part of where I'm going to halfway meet you, is that Paul has this tricky problem of what to do with meat sacrificed to idols, right? Because the Jerusalem
okay, this
Council has forbidden Christians to eat meat sacrificed to idols. And
right.
it seems to be that MMT seems to mention similar things, right? You
Yes, it
can't
does.
you can't use Gentile wheat in the bread that is made into the showbread because it's contaminated with pagan demons, right? Which actually kind of helps make a point that I'm trying to make in my presentation, by the way. But I'm going to leave that aside for the second. All right. So, right, eating pagan altar meat is a form of idolatry because it's been sacrificed to idols, right? And so that is the reason why Jews and also Christians shouldn't eat pagan meat. Okay, so you're starting a church in a place like Corinth that has very few Jews and a lot of pagans who are very used to buying their meat in the pagan meat marketplace, right? And this is the problem that Paul is encountering, is that he's this mostly Gentile congregation that he is trying to get and cajole into following this, Council of Jerusalem that he knows full well about, and that if he's not in full accordance with, he's going to get heat the next time that he tries to bring the money to offer to the people in Jerusalem as, look, the Corinthians, here's a pile of money from the church in Corinth. Isn't that evidence that God's at work in the Gentiles in Corinth, right? So this is the tricky place that Paul is in, and he's kind of finding some compromises that I'm not sure everyone present at the Council of Jerusalem would be happy with. Sort of like, well, if you don't know where it came from, then it's not a problem. And like, yeah, you can kind of mind over matter the deal, right? Like, if you know, like, yeah, we know the pagan gods don't exist. And like, as long as
Oh,
you kind of know, right, right, he's trying to find some exceptions to the rule while also holding up the rule, because he does say you cannot eat at the table of demons and the table of our Lord, when he's explaining why you shouldn't eat pagan meat. So he believes that, but he also kind of thinks like, yeah, you can mind over matter it in certain circumstances, but don't let people know that you're doing that because they might get confused, right?
Ultimately, the question you have to ask about Paul is, did Paul believe that Jews who convert to Christianity should circumcise their children or not?
Yeah.
You have to answer that question.
Yeah. And it's hard to get an answer to that question because of the Timothy stuff, right? And I think
Look,
Paul has a similar nuance. It kind of depends, and I have to tailor my message to my audience on the circumcision question that he has on the pagan meat question. And I think that you can see his heart in that question in his answer about the pagan
okay,
meat question.
Sam, if once you start your church, which should be any day now, and chas v'chalila,
If you give me all the money from your settlement, maybe then I'll start
you
my
my son. I just got my car. That's all I got, and it wasn't $1 million. But and chas v'chalila, God forbid, you baptize a Jew. Are you going to tell him to circumcise his kid?
baptize a Jew. You don't think you should baptize a Jew? You think baptism was just for the Gentiles?
Not in the. Oh, I think you should, but
No, in early Christianity, do you think that they baptized Jews?
I think that in early Christianity, people
Or
would get
Pauline, or
baptized daily.
well, that is certainly one of the old Jewish practices, but it seems very clear in multiple places in the New Testament, not just Paul, that Christianity redefined baptism to be a once and for all introductory thing.
Really? Are you
Right?
sure?
You can see that in Hebrews. You can see that certainly in the Pauline epistles. Acts seems to present it as it's the thing that gives you the Holy Spirit. And it's the way that you participate with Jesus's death and resurrection, which you are only supposed to do once, which the book of Hebrews is very explicit about. And it gets angry at people who might want to leave and come back, and then they would have to get baptized again, and that would be crucifying our Lord again. So you can't do that. Right, which is a pretty strong argument that they didn't baptize themselves
Where
daily.
is that from?
That's
Where's that?
Hebrews 6, probably.
Okay, so Hebrews, we can
Your
throw
other
that out.
favorite.
Look,
I'm not
Hebrews
throwing
was
the
not
book of
written by
Hebrews out.
Paul.
Again, the book of Hebrews has more historical relevance than MMT. It's more well historically attested. We know more about who wrote it and why and where it came from,
And
even though
and
it's one of the books of the New
if
Testament that we
one
know the
book
least
is
about.
going to be thrown by Christians out of their New Testament, it's Hebrews, and you know it.
No, there was some argument about it around in the 300s. That was but mainly because some people didn't think it was written by Paul,
Oh
which they
yeah,
were probably
and
right about. But
and the arguments around whether Paul wrote it recently have. I'm just making these up.
no, Origin talks about that, right? In
No, you're
190
talking about
AD.
the recent discussion about Paul in the Christian church that I have not instigated personally.
No, right. I mean, like I told you, no one argues more about Paul than Christians do themselves. So
I know. And guess what? A lot of Christians are eventually going to be able to read MMT once it comes out of being.
but you still haven't told me the bombshell in it. Okay, so so they don't think that you're supposed to use Gentile grown wheat for showbread. Okay,
No, no. Okay, you have to understand the context in which it is making an argument, right? If I'm having an argument with you, right, and both of us assume that of course Genesis is in the Bible, right, and we're having an argument about what Genesis means, right? That's a very different argument than me being like, that's not part of the Bible. When the
I still
argument,
don't understand the analogy.
um, the 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 field that the game was being played on is a different field than we thought it was being played on. when you're trying to look at the rules of the game, right?
Okay, but like
When you
all you're
find out
saying is
that,
that
oh,
previous versions of Christianity need to update with new information, which is something I totally agree with, and why I'm
okay,
totally on board about learning more new information. And I do think that we often misunderstood for a lot of Protestant history the relationship between Christianity and early Judaism and rules about these sorts of things. And that sort of new perspective on Paul was a lot to do with
I
that
have
increase
to,
in knowledge, and that
right.
I think that Christianity can keep improving itself by learning more and more about our New Testament and its context. And the reason why Christians argue so much about Paul is because we care about Paul
Okay.
and the
I
Book of
think that,
Hebrews, which I
okay,
still think is the master work of the entire New Testament. And you have yet to give me any
theological
convincing. It's a theological masterpiece, and you just don't
crime
like it
scene.
because it counteracts some of your arguments.
No, no, I was mad at you because I'm like, why are you like, why are you thinking that these quotes, like, we didn't know that it says in our Bible, God does not want sacrifices?
I mean, I think that you often misunderstand you're so vain you think the song is about you. Not everything in a Christian book was written to argue against the Jews 300 years later.
No.
Oftentimes, when it's trying to make a pointed point, it's making a pointed point against other Christians. That's like the book of Hebrews is more a criticism of other kinds of Christians than it is a criticism of any kind of Jew.
Um, the idea that God does not want sacrifices predates Jesus.
Great. The Christians knew that. That's why they quoted those verses. That was part of their point.
Um, no, I think they were quoting those verses because they didn't realize that the Jews knew that, and that's why they believe in PSA. Oh, come on. Your father was on my channel arguing that there must be a sacrifice in order for there to be an atonement,
Well,
right?
so Jacob, we're going far astray from MMT, and like it just seems like you're just like any place that I can find a place that I think is soft, I'm going to try and poke it. And I
I'm not
am
trying
not.
to poke anything. I'm just explaining to you what I'm seeing. I'm seeing that.
You still all right? Please tell me, and I will give you time, and then I
Okay,
should probably go soon. What exactly is
I,
so explosive about MM and MMT? And I've yet to see or
okay,
understand that.
okay. So we had our historical understanding of what history was kind of like, and updating that history is going to make a lot of people pay a lot more attention to exactly the types of arguments that Father Stephen DeYoung and N.T. Wright are making. A lot of people who think that those are wrong arguments.
When was MMT published in English? Probably like the 50s, along with a bunch of the other Qumran stuff.
It was published in English in the 1990s, and there was a huge court case against it uh, because they didn't want it to be published, and it went all the way to the Israeli
I'm
Supreme
seeing that some of
Court.
it was published in 1962, and then
Some
they
of it,
found some more scraps, and so
uh,
more of it got published as they published more and more
Sam,
scraps.
Sam, I can send you the court cases from the Israeli Supreme Court from the 90s. This is stuff that's coming out right now.
I remember the 90s, and I remember it being more about Lion King movies, but in any case, so Jacob, what is so explosive about it?
I told you
What?
our
What in
understanding,
particularly?
our
That could apply to MMT. That could apply to other Qumran scrolls. That could apply to the Ugaritic texts found up in Syria.
no, because when we didn't know that this was the positions of the Sadducees and probably the Essenes, was so much closer to rabbinic Judaism.
Okay, so how's that not undermine Judaism more than it undermines Christianity? Like,
Why would
what's?
it undermine Judaism?
Well, because you guys had your own history wrong or something. I don't know.
No, see, this is the thing. It's like our history is actually even more clearly right. Like this was part of what I was
So
talking
what
to you
about
about.
Jewish history, or what about Christian history was
I
wrong?
was
If you're
not,
saying
look,
some Christian
personally,
scholars had a misinterpretation of something, that's very
pers-
different than saying Christian history is wrong.
um,
Because it turns out
I
like probably everyone, including Jews, misunderstood the Pharisees or the Sadducees. So like, you
well,
know,
okay. So this is the thing. Okay, I'm not saying that Father Stephen DeYoung doesn't have a cogent story. I'm saying he's like the only person who does. I'm saying that a lot of Christians are going to have to rethink their theology in light of what we found out. That there's going to
which
have to
part of the
be.
theology?
Um, well, let's go back to whether or not Jews who convert should be circumcising their children.
Okay, what does MMT have to do with that particular question?
Um, the it does not leave a place for the type of understanding of acts that we had. Like the there did not exist a milieu in which Paul could be saying what Acts says he was saying.
What
The
was
way
Paul
a lot
saying
of
in
Christians
Acts
understood.
that is incompatible with MMT?
No, no, no.
And
Hold on. You could reinterpret Acts. You can't keep a lot of the present interpretations of Acts.
okay, fine. If we interpret Acts better, I'm all for it.
Okay, but that's going to be a large theological change for a lot of Christians,
In what particular respect?
and becoming a lot more like Judaism.
How so?
Um, it depends how they come up with a version. Like Father DeYoung's version seems to be coherent, as far as I can tell. I really,
Okay, but then that's
I
like,
only read
but
this
then
last
how are the
Sunday.
Catholics are even different than what Father DeYoung's saying? Father DeYoung's saying the Orthodox
Which
have been doing it right for 2,000 years. So
No, no, not exactly. You have to understand, Father DeYoung, he has a very particular way. Like the people who disagree with NT Wright, a lot of them are going to have to change how their beliefs, because the laity is, this stuff is going to eventually get to the laity, and I think there's going to be large theological shifts in Christianity. That's what I'm
great.
telling you.
So like
Yeah, yes, yes, I am beyond excited about this.
okay, but all
But
right.
what?
I think I kind of know where you're going. But anyway, I should get going because I have to go upstairs for
I should
dinner soon.
too.
But
Okay.
Jeff said this was fun being able to live stream the forum. All right, and Tyler, yeah, I would love Daniel Borearin to come on my channel. I think that the Jews were binitarian and the Christians were too is a much weaker argument than people suspect. But I will grant that there was some two power ishness that
and
I think.
Sartori keeps on throwing Summers at me.
What?
So you know of Summers, Sommers.
No.
Sartori keeps on throwing Summers at me. He's
Which
this
Summers?
conservative. Just Sommers. He's he is saying that he has been making the argument that the Trinity is perfectly acceptable in Judaism.
No.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, the book that most undermines two powers theology is the book, the Epistle to the Hebrews, which seems to be explicitly written against such a theology, but that also proves that it must have existed in order for it to be written against it. So that's my short answer, Tyler. But yeah, I should talk to Daniel Boyarin.
Okay, I need to go too. Sorry I didn't answer all the people in the thing. This has been a long chat. I will have another thing later. Bye, people.
All right. You broke your records though.